The day Silas Voss rode into Blackridge Pass, he didn't knock on a single door. He kicked them open. He walked straight into Elena Ashcroft's clinic mid-afternoon, grabbed the jar of medicine she was measuring for old Mrs. Pickett's chest infection, and threw it against the wall. Glass and powdered bark scattered across the floor she had scrubbed that same morning. "You're treating people on land that belongs to my operation now," he said, not even raising his voice. "Pack your bottles, widow. You've got 30 days. Elena didn't scream. She didn't cry. She looked at the mess on the floor, then looked back at him. And that silence scared Voss more than anything she could have said. If that were you, if a man walked into the one thing you built from nothing and told you it was already gone, what would you do? Stay with us. Because what Elena Ashcroft did next changed everything about this mountain, and about the man who thought he owned it. If this story already has you holding your breath, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss what comes next. Drop a like and tell us in the comments. What city or country are you watching from? I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now let's go back to where it all truly began. The clinic wasn't much. Elena knew that better than anyone. 2 rooms carved out of a building that used to be a feed storage shed, the walls still carrying the faint ghost of grain dust, no matter how many times she whitewashed them. 1 room for examining patients, 1 room where she kept her supplies in labeled jars along a shelf her husband Thomas had built the summer before he died. The shelf was the only thing in Blackridge Pass that still had his handwriting on it, each label in his careful, deliberate script because Elena's hands had been busy with the children when he made it. She kept that shelf. She kept everything that still had Thomas on it. That was 3 years ago, and in those 3 years, Elena Ashcroft had learned something that nobody in Blackridge Pass had the decency to say out loud. Grief doesn't leave. It just gets quieter. It sits down in the corner of the room and stops screaming, but it never packs its bags and walks out the door. Some mornings she woke up reaching across the empty side of the bed before her mind caught up with her body, and those mornings were the hardest. She had learned to get out of bed fast on those mornings. Fast enough that the feeling couldn't fully land. She had 2 reasons to get out of bed fast. Their names were Clara and James. Clara was 8, serious in the way only children who have watched their parents suffer can be serious. She had Thomas's dark eyes and his habit of chewing the inside of her cheek when she was thinking through a problem. She had also, somewhere along the way, taken on the habit of watching her mother the way a hawk watches a field. Not predatory, just alert. Always alert. Like she understood at 8 years old that the person holding everything together needed someone keeping watch. James was 6. He was the opposite of his sister in nearly every way. Loud where she was quiet, impulsive where she was careful, prone to showing up at the clinic with muddy boots, and a question that had nothing to do with anything Elena was doing. He asked why the sky changed colors at sunset 3 days in a row until she sat down with him after supper and actually explained it. He was satisfied for exactly 1 evening before he came back with a follow-up question about clouds. James was going to be fine. Elena was almost certain of it. Clara was the one who worried her. They lived in 2 rooms above the clinic, which meant her children grew up hearing her talk to sick people through the floorboards. They grew up knowing the names of plants and which ones could reduce a fever and which ones, handled wrong, could stop a heart. They grew up understanding that death was not a stranger. It was a neighbor who sometimes came calling, and you could slow it down, but you couldn't always keep it out. Most children in Blackridge Pass were not raised this way. Most children in Blackridge Pass were also not the children of the widow healer who lived above the old feed shed, so the town tolerated Elena. That was the honest word for it. Tolerated. They came to her when they needed her, which was often enough. Frontier settlements didn't have the luxury of turning away someone who knew how to set a broken arm or manage a complicated birth. When Hattie Monroe's baby came wrong side in February, it was Elena who stayed through the night and turned the infant by hand, and Hattie's husband shook Elena's hand afterward like she'd done him a simple favor. Didn't look her in the eye, didn't mention it in town, just shook her hand, pressed some coins into her palm, and walked away like the whole terrifying night had never happened. She wasn't a doctor. She knew that. She had never claimed otherwise. What she was capable, and capable had kept this town alive through 2 hard winters and a fever that swept through the valley in October and took 4 people, which might have been 10 without her. She knew herbal preparations. She knew how wounds behaved. She knew the difference between a cough that would clear in a week and a cough that meant something was growing in the lungs. She had learned from her mother, who learned from her mother, who had been the only woman in their county trusted with difficult births. The knowledge had been passed down like a family heirloom. Not glamorous, not celebrated, just necessary. Blackridge Pass needed her. The town just didn't want to admit it out loud. What they did instead was talk. They talked about how it was unusual for a woman alone to run a business. They talked about whether her remedies were truly trustworthy or whether she was making things up as she went. They talked, quietly, about whether it was appropriate for a widow to be seeing male patients without a chaperone. Elena heard all of it and answered none of it. She had learned early that responding to cruelty only gave it more room to spread. You let it exhaust itself, or you outlasted it. Either way, you didn't hand it more air. She had been outlasting things since she was 17 years old. The morning that would eventually lead her to everything, to Rowan, to the mountain, to the fight she didn't know was coming, started the way most of her mornings started. She was up before the children, measuring out preparations for the week ahead, working in the gray pre-dawn quiet that was the only time the clinic felt entirely her own. Clara and James were still asleep. Through the thin ceiling, she could hear James making the small sounds he always made in deep sleep, like a puppy dreaming of running. She used to find it endearing. 3 years in, she found it something closer to sacred. She was pouring dried willow bark into one of Thomas's labeled jars when she heard the horse. One horse, heavy-footed, walking slow. Not the gait of someone coming in distress. No urgency in the hoofbeats. Just steady, deliberate, like the rider had somewhere to be and wasn't in any particular hurry, but was definitely coming here. Elena set down the jar. She looked at the door. She was not a woman who startled easily. Startling was a luxury you surrendered when you ran a clinic alone. Whatever came through that door, you handled it. But something about that slow, heavy approach made the back of her neck go still and alert in a way she couldn't quite name. The door opened before she could cross the room to it. He had to turn slightly sideways to fit through the frame. That was her first impression of Rowan Thorne. That the door was not built for him, and he knew it, and he stepped through the space anyway without drama or apology, just adjusted his angle and came through like he'd been doing it his whole life. I was tall in the way that mountains are tall, not in the way that men are tall. There's a difference. Men who are simply tall tend to wear it. They straighten their spines. They hold their shoulders back. They occupy the room with announcement. This man just stood there. The room got smaller without him doing anything in particular. He was holding his left arm against his side in a way that wasn't quite right. Not forced. More like he'd been protecting it for long enough that the compensation had become automatic. His hat was in his right hand, held at his thigh, and his face was the kind of face that didn't give much away. Not because it was cold, but because whatever emotions lived there had settled deep, like water finding its level below the surface. "I was told you could help with this," he said. His voice was low, not loud, and it didn't fill the room the way she might have expected from a man his size. It just arrived. "If it's too early, I can wait outside." Elena looked at his arm, then at his face. Then she said, "Sit down." He sat. The chair protested. What followed was an examination that told her several things at once. The wound on his forearm, a clean gash that had been closed badly, stitches placed by someone who knew the concept of stitching but not the practice of it, had been 2 days old when whoever stitched it did the work, and was now infected along the upper edge where the thread pulled too tight. It was not dangerous yet. In another 3 days, it would become a different conversation. "Who did this?" she asked, not looking up from the wound. "Myself," he said, "best I could manage." "You stitched your own arm." "I did." She looked up then. He met her eyes without flinching, without any particular pride in the statement, just acknowledging what had happened. She had learned to read what men weren't saying, and what this man wasn't saying was, there was no one else to ask. "It's going to need to come out," she said. "All of it. And it's going to hurt." "All right. I don't have anything strong for the pain. I have something that will dull the edge." "Don't need it," she almost argued. Then she looked at his face again and decided he meant it. And she respected a man who knew his own tolerance without performing it. She opened the wound, cleaned it, and closed it properly. He made one sound, a short, compressed exhale through his nose, when she pulled the infected thread free. That was all. She worked in silence, and he let her work. and there was something unexpectedly respectful about the way he sat still and didn't ask questions or make conversation to manage his own discomfort. When it was done, she wrapped the arm and told him what to watch for. "How much?" he asked. She told him the price. It was fair. She charged what people could pay, scaled to what she knew about their circumstances, and she knew nothing about this man's circumstances, except that he had come alone and stitched his own arm. She charged him the same she would have charged any working rancher. He paid her, counted it out exact, and then he didn't leave. He sat in the chair that was too small for him, hat still in his right hand, looking at the floor. Elena was already moving to clean her instruments when she noticed he hadn't moved. "Something else?" she asked. He looked up, and there was something in his face that she hadn't seen there before, a kind of careful deliberation, like a man standing at the edge of a creek deciding whether the crossing was worth it. "I have a son," he said. "He's 7. His mother died a year and a half ago." Elena set down what she was holding. She turned to face him fully. "I have a homestead on the north side of the ridge," he continued. 400 acres. I built the house myself, most of it. It's not finished." He paused. "I work it alone. I haven't—" Another pause, shorter this time. "I haven't managed it the way I should. The boy doesn't have what he should have. I don't know how to give it to him by myself." Elena was quiet. She was waiting for the part where this became something she needed to respond to. "I'm not good at talking around things," he said, "so I'll say it plain. I've been asking around about you. People in this town have a lot to say, and most of it isn't fair. What I kept hearing underneath all of it was that you're capable and you're honest and you keep your word. Those aren't small things." He looked at her steadily. "I'm asking if you'd be willing to consider a different kind of arrangement for both our families." The room was very quiet. "You're proposing," Elena said flatly. "I'm proposing a conversation," he said, "about a proposal." She stared at him. He stared back. Neither of them was blinking particularly fast. "Mr. Thorne, Rowan Thorne. Mr. Thorne." She heard her own voice come out more even than she felt. "You walked in here at 6 in the morning with a badly infected arm. You let me pull thread out of your skin without flinching, and now you're asking me to consider marrying you. You don't know my children. You don't know me. I don't know you or your son or your land or what not finished means when you're describing a house." She stopped. "Do you do everything this direct?" "Mostly," he said. She picked up what she'd set down. She turned back to her instruments. Her hands were busy and her mind was moving faster than her hands, which was not a comfortable feeling. "Come back in 3 days," she said. "I need to look at the wound anyway." He stood, put his hat on, moved toward the door, that slight sideways angle to clear the frame. "Mr. Thorne." He stopped. "What happened to your wife?" She asked it without turning around. She heard him stop, heard the quality of the silent shift. "That's a fair question," he said. I'll answer it when you're ready to hear it." Then he was gone, and the hoofbeats moved away slow and heavy, and Elena stood at her workbench with her hands not quite moving and her chest doing something she hadn't felt it do in 3 years. She told herself it was wariness. She was good at telling herself things. Clara appeared in the doorway an hour later, hair uncombed, still half asleep, wearing the look that meant she'd been awake longer than she was letting on. "Who was that?" she asked. "A patient." Clara looked at the door the man had gone through, then back at her mother. Her jaw worked the inside of her cheek once, twice. "He had a big horse," she said. "Yes," Elena agreed. "It was nice, the horse." "Clara." "I'm just saying." Elena handed her a jar to carry upstairs and didn't answer. Behind her, she heard Clara padding up the stairs, and she thought, not for the first time and not for the last time, that her 8-year-old daughter understood more about what was happening in this family than Elena was comfortable admitting. She thought about the shelf with Thomas's handwriting on it. She thought about Rowan Thorne's face when he said the boy doesn't have what he should have. She thought, a man who stitches his own arm and still shows up. And then she told herself to stop thinking, because thinking had a way of becoming feeling, and feeling had a way of becoming foolish, and she had 2 children who needed her to be anything but foolish. She picked up the next jar. She got back to work. But 3 days later, when his horse came slow and heavy up the road right on schedule, she was already at the door before he knocked. And she would not admit, not to Clara, not to James, not to anyone in Blackridge Pass, that she had been aware of what day it was from the moment she woke up that morning. She opened the door. He stood there with his hat in his hand again, the arm held careful, and his face doing that same thing, settled deep, like water at its level. "Come in," she said, and she stepped aside. And whatever came next, whatever the mountain and the man and the cruelty of Silas Voss would eventually demand of her, it all began right there, in that moment, with the door swinging open in the gray morning light. He came back on the third day exactly when he said he would, and Elena had told herself at least a dozen times that morning that this was a medical visit and nothing more. She checked his arm. The infection had not spread. The new stitching was holding clean, the skin around it beginning to knit the way it was supposed to. She changed the dressing without saying much, and he sat without fidgeting, and the silence between them was the kind that didn't particularly need filling. "It's healing well," she said. "Good. Keep it dry another week." "All right." She stepped back. He made no move to leave. She had half expected that, which bothered her more than she wanted to admit. "You said you'd answer my question," she said, "when I was ready." He looked at her for a moment. "Are you?" She folded her hands in front of her. "I'm asking, aren't I?" Rowan Thorne set his hat on his knee and looked at the floor for a moment, not avoiding the question, she realized, but finding the right place to enter it. There's a difference between a man who stalls and a man who is careful with words because he means to use them correctly. "Her name was Margaret," he said. "We married young. I was 22, she was 19. We both wanted the land, wanted to build something. For the first few years it worked the way we both thought it would." He stopped. "Then it didn't." Elena waited. "She was unhappy up there," he said. "The mountain, the isolation. I didn't see it fast enough, and by the time I did, she'd been unhappy for a long time already. She started going into town more. I let her because what else do you do? She met people there, one person in particular." His jaw tightened slightly, just once, and then released. "I found out the way a man usually finds out, too late and all at once." "Did you?" Elena started carefully. "I didn't hurt her," he said, flat and direct, like he'd anticipated the question and wanted it off the table. "I'm telling you that not because I expect you to believe it on my word alone, but because it's true. And I'd rather you know it now than wonder about it later. We argued. We argued badly. She left to go stay with her sister in the valley. She took Daniel, our son, with her. 3 weeks later, she was thrown from a horse on a trail he had no business being on in November." The room held that for a moment. "Daniel was in the wagon when it happened," Rowan said. "He was 5. He saw it." He looked up. "That's why he's quiet." Elena felt something shift behind her sternum. She didn't let it show on her face, but it moved through her the way cold water moves, immediate and full. "The town thinks I did something to cause it," he said, "or that I drove her away, which they've decided amounts to the same thing. I'm not going to fight that. People believe what settles easiest for them, and a woman who dies young needs someone to blame." He picked up his hat. "I just thought you should hear the version that actually happened." Elena looked at him for a long moment. "Why me?" "I told you why. You told me what people said about me. That's not the same as why me, specifically." He held her gaze. "Because you didn't believe what they said about me either. You asked me directly." A beat. "That's not as common as it should be." She didn't have an answer for that. Or rather, she had one, and she wasn't ready to give it. "I'll think about it," she said. "That's all I'm asking." He left. The door closed behind him, and Elena stood in her clinic with one hand resting on the workbench, and her mind doing something she usually kept it from doing, running forward, into the shape of a thing that hadn't happened yet. She stopped it. She picked up the next task on her list. She kept moving. But that evening, after supper, when James had finally worn himself out, and Clara was sitting across from her at the small table doing the reading. Elena had assigned her. Elena found herself watching her daughter and thinking about a 5-year-old boy who had seen something no child should see, and had apparently gone quiet inside himself and stayed that way. Clara looked up and caught her watching. "What?" "Nothing," Elena said. "How's the reading?" Clara looked back down at her book. Her jaw worked the inside of her cheek once. "The man from this morning," she said, not looking up. "Is he coming back?" Elena considered lying. She considered deflecting. She did neither. "Probably," she said. Clara read another line. Okay, she said. That was all. But the word carried weight, the way words do when an 8-year-old has been thinking something through alone and finally decided to allow it. The following week, Rowan came back. Not with a medical reason. The arm was healing fine, and they both knew it. He came in the mid-morning when the clinic was quiet, and he stood just inside the door with his hat in his hand and said, "I'd like to take you to see the land. If you're willing, bring the children." Elena thought about saying she needed more time. She thought about the list of reasons this was complicated, risky, premature. "Saturday," she said, "after morning rounds." He nodded, put his hat on, and left. Clara was in the back room and had definitely heard every word. Saturday was dry and cold, the kind of fall morning that made the air taste like iron and pine. Elena packed a bag with practical things, a change of clothes for James, who could be counted on to find the muddiest possible route between any 2 points, a small medical kit out of habit, food for the children, because they couldn't be trusted to last past noon without eating. She dressed in her plainest working clothes. She pinned her hair back with the efficiency of someone who had stopped spending time on appearance the same month she stopped reaching across an empty bed. Rowan arrived with a wagon, which surprised her. She had expected him on horseback, and the wagon, a sturdy, well-maintained thing pulled by 2 even-tempered horses, struck her as a deliberate consideration. He had thought about the children. He had thought about what the ride would require. She didn't say anything about it, but she noticed. James climbed into the wagon with the enthusiasm of a 6-year-old encountering a large thing to climb, which is to say, immediately and without asking anyone's permission. Clara waited, watched Rowan's face without appearing to watch it, then climbed in with careful dignity. Rowan helped Elena up without making it into anything. A hand offered, received, withdrawn. Clean and simple. Seated in the back, not quite touching her mother's arm, Clara watched the back of Rowan's head as he drove, and she did not say a single word for the first hour. The mountain road was rough in places, and Rowan didn't pretend otherwise. He took the worst sections slow, watching the horses, and at one point a wheel caught a rut hard enough to jolt everyone sideways, and James shrieked with delight, and Clara grabbed the sideboard with both hands and shot Elena a look that clearly communicated, "Why are we doing this?" "How much farther?" Elena asked. 20 minutes, Rowan said. "Once we clear the switchback." "There's a switchback?" 2. Clara made a sound that was not quite a word. They cleared the switchbacks. The wagon came through a gap in the tree line, and the homestead opened up ahead of them, and whatever Elena had been preparing herself to see, something rough, something half-built, something she'd have to make herself be generous about, it wasn't quite that. It was not finished. He had said that clearly. The main house was solid, 2 stories, good timber, the kind of construction that meant someone had taken real care with the bones of the thing. But the east wing was framed without walls, open to the sky, and the front porch had boards missing in 2 places where someone had clearly started a repair and not gotten back to it. The yard was working rough, not neglected rough. There's a difference. Neglect has a particular look, a kind of slackness. This place had just been run by a man with too much to do and not enough hands. A boy appeared in the doorway of the house. He was small for 7, or at least he looked small standing in that big doorway. He had Rowan's coloring, dark hair, the same quality of stillness in the face. He looked at the wagon, looked at Elena, looked at Clara and James, and didn't move toward them or away. He just stood there and watched. James was already halfway off the wagon. "Hi," he said at full volume to the boy in the doorway. "Do you have animals?" The boy looked at him. A long pause. "Chickens," he said finally, "and a mule." "Can I see them?" Another pause. The boy stepped off the porch. "The mule kicks," he said. "I'm James." "Daniel." They walked around the side of the house together, James already talking, Daniel already not talking, which meant they had apparently reached some agreement. Elena watched them go and felt something loosen slightly in her chest that she hadn't known was tight. Rowan climbed down from the wagon and stood beside her. "He doesn't usually do that," he said quietly. "Go with someone?" "Speak, at all, to new people." Elena watched the 2 boys disappear around the corner. Clara was still in the wagon, arms crossed, and Elena could feel her daughter watching Rowan with the calm, assessing patience of a child who has learned that first impressions need to be tested. Show me the house, Elena said to Rowan. He showed her. Every room, every unfinished corner, every place where he'd had to stop because there were only so many hours, and he was only one man. He didn't make excuses, but he also didn't perform indifference about what the house could have been with more time and more hands. He showed it to her the way you'd show someone a thing you'd built and were honest enough not to dress up. The kitchen was the best room. Someone had put real work into the kitchen. The counter was solid and level, the shelving well fitted, the light coming through the window at an angle that hit the whole space clean, and even in the morning. Elena stopped there longer than anywhere else and said nothing, and Rowan let her stand there without filling the silence. Thomas built a shelf, she said, not quite meaning to say it out loud. Rowan looked at her. He didn't ask who Thomas was. He seemed to understand that some things arrive on their own terms. I'd have to continue my work, she said. The clinic. I won't give that up. I know. The people in the valley need someone. I can't just disappear up a mountain. I'm not asking you to disappear. There are settlements closer to the ridge that need a healer too. You could work from here and reach them easier than from town. She looked at him. You've thought about this. I have. For how long? A pause. Longer than I'm going to admit right now. She almost smiled. She caught it and held it back, not entirely sure why. The children would need time. Of course. I don't know you, not really. No, he agreed. You don't. That's what time is for. She walked to the window in the kitchen and looked out at the yard where, distantly, she could hear James being loud about something and the chickens responding with what sounded like genuine outrage. She could not hear Daniel's voice, but she could hear James talking at him, which meant Daniel was probably still there, still listening. That was not nothing. Clara is harder to win, Elena said. If you're thinking this is going to be simple. I'm not thinking anything is going to be simple. She's protective. Good, he said, with what sounded like complete sincerity. She should be. Elena turned back from the window. Clara was now standing in the kitchen doorway, arms still crossed, looking at Rowan with the flat, ungovernable scrutiny of a child who has decided to form her own opinion, regardless of what the adults in the room think about it. Why does your house have holes in it? Clara asked. Rowan looked at her with neither amusement nor offense. Because I ran out of time, he said. Working alone goes slow. Why are you alone? Clara? Elena started. It's a fair question, Rowan said. He looked at Clara directly. My wife died, same as your father. I've been doing everything myself since then, and I haven't been fast enough about all of it. Clara considered this. Do you know how to fix the holes? Yes. Then why haven't you? I've been trying to keep the whole place from falling apart at once, he said. When you're one person and there are 10 things wrong, you work on the things that break first. Clara uncrossed her arms. Just slightly. Not fully, but enough. My mom fixes things too, she said. She fixed Mr. Harlan's wagon wheel last spring, and he didn't even say thank you. People do that, Rowan said. It's rude. Yes, he agreed. It is. Clara looked at him for another long moment. Then she walked past him to the window and looked out at the yard the way her mother had. James is going to scare those chickens, she said. Probably, Rowan said. He scares all animals. He's too loud. Daniel will tell him to quiet down if they get too rattled. He cares about the chickens. Clara looked at that for a moment. The information about Daniel and the chickens. Something in her face shifted, too small to name but real enough to see. Okay, she said, and walked back out the door. Elena watched her go. Then she looked at Rowan. That was better than I expected, she said carefully. I wasn't performing, he said. I know, she said. That's why. They ate lunch on the porch, or what remained of the porch, sitting on planks and upended crates because there was no proper furniture out here yet. Elena had brought bread and cold meat and a jar of pickled vegetables she'd put up in September, and Rowan made coffee over the outdoor fire in a pot that had clearly seen better decades. It was strong enough to strip paint. She drank it without complaint, and he raised an eyebrow. Good coffee, she lied. It's terrible, he said. It's really terrible, she agreed, and it was the first time she genuinely smiled at something he said, and she was aware of it afterward, the way you're aware of a sound that's been missing for a long time suddenly returning. Daniel ate next to James, not talking, eating steadily. James was already at the stage where he'd said everything he had to say on the subject of the mule and had moved on to asking Daniel what the mountain looked like in winter. Daniel looked at his bread. "White," he said. James considered this. "Everything?" "Everything." "Cool," James said with complete sincerity. Daniel looked at him sideways. Something that was almost, not quite, the beginning of an expression crossed his face. Not a smile, too guarded for that, but something in the direction of one. On the ride home, James fell asleep against Elena's arm before they cleared the first switchback. Clara sat across from her, watching the trees, and didn't speak for a long time. The wagon moved through the late afternoon cold, and Rowan drove without talking, which Elena was beginning to understand was simply his natural mode, present without demanding attention. "I like Daniel," Clara said finally, to no one in particular. Elena looked at her. "Yeah?" "He doesn't talk too much," Clara said, as though this were the highest possible recommendation. Elena looked out at the trees. The light was going gold and low through the pines. The cold was real now, settling in, and James was warm and heavy against her side. She thought about Rowan's kitchen and the light in it. She thought about Thomas's shelf, 3 miles away, with his handwriting on the labels. She thought about the east wing with no walls, open to the sky, waiting. She thought, a man who tells you it's not finished instead of pretending it is. There were things she still didn't know. There were things that still scared her. Not about him specifically, but about the simple fact of trying again. About handing her children's lives and her own rebuilt one to the uncertainty of another person. About whether the grief she'd learned to carry quietly would suddenly become too loud in a house that wasn't hers. These were not small things. But neither was a boy who said white when asked about the snow, and almost smiled. 2 weeks later, she asked Rowan to start telling her the rest. Not the arranged version, not the things that made him look reasonable, the actual rest of it. The parts that were hard to say. They sat in her clinic after her last patient of the day, the light going out the window, and he talked for almost an hour. About the years before Margaret's unhappiness. About the things he'd gotten wrong, not because he was cruel, but because he hadn't been paying the right kind of attention. About what he thought he could have done differently, and what he believed he couldn't have changed no matter what. She listened. She didn't interrupt. When he stopped, she thought about everything he'd said, and then she said, "Do you know what the difference is between a man who tells me that story to make himself look good, and a man who tells it because it's honest?" He looked at her. "The man who tells it honest," she said, "includes the parts that make him look like an idiot." "I included at least 3 of those," he said. "You did," she agreed. She reached across the space between them and touched the back of his hand once, briefly, and then pulled back. It was not a romantic gesture exactly. It was more like a signal, an acknowledgement. "I heard you, and I'm still here." He looked down at his hand, then up at her. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. But the town was a different matter. She had known the rumors would start when they did. She had known it the way you know weather is coming when you live on a frontier. You can feel the shift in pressure before the first cloud appears. What she hadn't anticipated was the velocity of it, or the particular viciousness that took hold when people decided they were being excluded from information they felt entitled to. Martha Greer was the one who said it first, and loudest. Martha Greer had an opinion on everything that happened within a 5-mile radius, and had never once in Elena's recollection formed that opinion from anything resembling direct evidence. She cornered Elena outside the dry goods store on a Tuesday morning in late October and did not bother with preamble. "People are saying you've been going up to the Thorne property," Martha said. Not a question. "People can say what they like," Elena said, trying to pass. Martha stepped half into her path. Not quite a block. Just enough to require acknowledgement. "You know what he did to that woman." Elena stopped. She turned. She looked at Martha Greer with the expression she had developed over 3 years of having her competence, her character, and her choices commented on by people who had never done half of what she had. "What did he do?" Elena said, specifically. "Not what you heard, what you know." Martha blinked. "Everyone knows." "What do you know?" Elena said again, and her voice was still calm, which was somehow more pointed than anger. "Specifically, you. What did you personally witness or verify?" The silence lasted about 4 seconds. That was all the answer Elena needed. "That's what I thought," Elena said, and walked past her. But Martha wasn't the only one, and a single confrontation doesn't stop a current. It just makes you wet. By the end of the week, two women had stopped bringing their children to Elena for routine care, citing reasons that didn't quite add up. A man who owed her payment for 3 months came to settle his account with an expression that suggested he wanted to wash his hands of the arrangement. The minister's wife stopped her on the street and took her hand with the special kind of sympathy that is really just judgment dressed in softer fabric. "We're only worried about you, dear," she said. "A woman in your position—" "My position is fine," Elena said, and kept walking. It wasn't fine. That was the thing she couldn't say out loud and couldn't stop knowing. The two patients she'd lost, families who'd pulled back, those weren't just social slights. That was income. That was the margin between managing and not managing, in a life that already had no room for error. She told Rowan because she had started telling him things, which surprised her every time she noticed herself doing it. He listened. He didn't minimize it or tell her it would pass. He said, "Is it bad enough to make you reconsider?" She looked at him. They were sitting on the steps of her clinic in the early evening, the children inside, the town quiet for once. "No," she said. "Good. But I'm not going to pretend it doesn't cost something." "I know," he said. "I'm sorry for the part that's my reputation landing on you." "It's not your reputation," she said. "It's their imagination. There's a difference." He nodded slowly. She could see something in his face. Gratitude, maybe. Or the particular relief of a person who has been defended for the first time in a long time and didn't realize how much they'd needed it. "I have to tell Daniel something," he said after a while. "More than I have. About his mother. About what happened. He's 7 now, and he's carrying something I haven't given him the words for. That's not right." Elena was quiet for a moment. "When you're ready." "I keep thinking I'm waiting for the right moment, but I don't think there is a right moment. I think I'm just scared." She thought about Clara, who had been 2 when Thomas got sick, who had watched her father go by degrees and had never been given a proper explanation because Elena had told herself she was too young. And then Thomas was gone and Clara was 5, and the explanation was overdue, and the conversation had been one of the hardest Elena had ever had. "You're not wrong to be scared," she said. "It's still the right thing." He nodded. He looked out at the road. "I'm going to do it soon." "I know you will," she said, and she meant it. She wasn't performing confidence in him. She actually believed it, which was itself a thing she hadn't expected to find in this particular season of her life. Another person she could believe in, from the evidence of his actions rather than the promise of his words. The cold deepened that week, and the week after. Rowan came into town every few days, and Elena made no effort to hide it because hiding things had never been her way, and she wasn't going to start now for the sake of Martha Greer's imagination. Clara began asking about Daniel with a casualness that did not fool Elena for a second. James announced at supper one evening that he had decided Daniel was his best friend, and that Daniel had said the mountain gets so much snow in January that sometimes you can't open the barn door from outside. "That sounds difficult," Elena said. "Daniel said his dad dug a tunnel once," James said, with the reverence of someone describing a great achievement. "A real tunnel, through the snow." Elena looked at her soup. "Can we go to the mountain again?" James asked. Clara was looking at the table with studied indifference, which meant she wanted to go but wasn't going to say so because she had more dignity than her brother. "We'll see," Elena said. James opened his mouth to argue the point. "James?" Clara said, without looking up. James closed his mouth. Elena looked at her daughter, this serious, watchful, quietly ferocious child, and thought about what she'd said about Daniel. He doesn't talk too much. The way she'd said it, like it was the beginning of an understanding rather than an observation. The way 8-year-olds form the early versions of the friendships that will matter later. There was something forming here. She could feel it the way she'd felt the pressure shift before bad weather, except this time it wasn't bad weather. It was something she didn't have a better word for yet, except that it felt, tentatively, cautiously, with every qualification she could put around the word, like the shape of a future. She was terrified of it. She held on to it anyway. Because the alternative was letting fear decide everything, and she had buried Thomas in the spring mud and raised 2 children alone in a town that tolerated her and kept going. And if she had learned anything in 3 years of that, it was this. Fear is not a good enough reason to stop. She just had to keep reminding herself of that, on the days when the cost was high and the outcome was still unclear. Those days, she got up fast, the same as always, and she kept moving. The first snow came early that year. It arrived overnight without warning, the way the worst things tend to arrive, quietly, while everyone was looking somewhere else. Elena woke to white light coming through the window at an angle that wasn't right for the hour, and she knew before she fully opened her eyes what had happened to the world outside. November, and already the ground was covered. Rowan had mentioned this as a possibility. She had filed it away as something to think about later. Later had apparently arrived ahead of schedule. She was making breakfast when the knock came. Not Rowan's knock. She had already learned the particular rhythm of his knuckles on her door, unhurried and definite, 2 knocks and a pause. This was faster, younger. She opened it to find Pete Calder's oldest boy on her step, 13 years old and breathing hard, his face the particular color of a child who has been running in cold air. "Dad's hand," the boy said. "The saw." She grabbed her kit without putting down her coffee and followed him at a pace that was nearly a run, and she didn't think about the snow or the cold or the breakfast getting cold on the table. This was the part of her work she was best at, the pivot, the immediate narrowing of focus to what was in front of her. Thomas used to say she became a different person the moment something needed fixing. She thought he'd meant it as a compliment. She was never entirely sure. Pete Calder had taken 2 fingers badly, the middle and the ring, and had wrapped his own hand in a flour sack that was now soaked through. His wife Nora was holding his wrist and crying with the controlled efficiency of a woman who was going to fall apart completely the moment the crisis passed, and not 1 second before. Elena got to work. The fingers were salvageable, both of them, though the ring finger would give him trouble for the rest of his life. She worked for 40 minutes without stopping, and when she was done, Pete Calder was pale and sweating but intact, and Nora had moved from controlled crying to the kind of quiet shaking that meant the adrenaline was leaving her system. "You'll keep the fingers," Elena said. "Don't use that hand for 6 weeks. Don't tell me you can't manage 6 weeks because the alternative is worse." Pete looked at his hand. "Thank you," he said, and he actually meant it, which made it different from Hattie Monroe's husband and his insufficient handshake. Some people said thank you like they were paying a bill. Pete said it like he understood what he was thanking her for. She was back at her clinic by 8 in the morning, hands washed, kit restocked, and that was when she saw Rowan's horse outside, and Rowan himself standing in the street with an expression she hadn't seen on his face before. Not anger. Not exactly. Something harder than that and more controlled. "What happened?" she said. He waited until she was close enough that he didn't need to raise his voice. "Silas Voss came to the property yesterday evening," he said. "Brought 2 men with him I've never seen. They had survey stakes." Elena went still. "He was on your land?" "At the edge of it. He said he was there as a courtesy, to inform me that a surveyor had found an error in the original land documentation and that the north boundary of my property was incorrectly recorded." Rowan's voice stayed level, but there was something underneath it that reminded her of the wound he'd stitched himself. The damage was real. The expression of it was minimal. "He said the corrected survey places my house and the upper grazing land outside my legal boundary." "That's not possible," Elena said immediately. "No," Rowan said, "it isn't. Your deed, I have the original deed. I have the survey documentation from when I filed. I have everything." He looked at her, which is why Voss was smiling when he said it. Elena understood then. A man doesn't smile when he's delivering bad news unless the bad news is itself the message. Unless the point is not the information, but the demonstration that he can walk onto your property and say whatever he likes, and you cannot stop him from saying it. "He wants the mountain," she said. "He wants what's under it," Rowan said. "There's ore in the North Ridge. Has been for years. I knew it. Didn't do anything with it. Didn't want to tear up the land." He looked past her at something she couldn't see. "Voss has been buying up mining rights across the territory for 2 years. I didn't think he'd come this far north." "Who told you about the buying?" "Hector Marsh, rancher about 12 miles east. He sold out last spring, said the offer was fair and he was tired of fighting the land. But last month he told me the survey they used to establish his boundary cut 2 acres out of his original deed, and the way the purchase was written, those acres went with the land." Rowan looked at her directly. "He wasn't the first." Elena stood in the cold street and thought about this with the same focused attention she gave a wound she was trying to understand before she touched it. How many? She asked. I don't know yet. Marsh mentioned 3 names. Could be more. She thought about Voss's smile. A man who smiles like that has done this before, which means he has a method, which means the method can be found. I need to see your deed, she said. The original. And any correspondence you have from the county office. Everything. Rowan looked at her. You know land law? I know how to read, she said, and I know when something doesn't add up. Bring me the documents. He brought them that afternoon, a rolled leather case worn smooth at the edges, and she spread them on her workbench and read for 2 hours while James narrated a battle between 2 sticks in the corner, and Clara sat at the table pretending to do her schoolwork and actually watching Elena's face for information. The deed was clean. The survey coordinates were precise, dated, signed by a county official whose name she wrote down carefully. The north boundary was exactly where Rowan said it was, which meant Voss's surveyor had either made an error, unlikely, given the smile, or had deliberately filed a conflicting document. Either way, the question was not what the truth was. The question was which document the county would choose to recognize and why. Clara, Elena said, not looking up. Yes? Who is the county land registrar? Clara blinked. How would I know that? You listened to everything. You listened to everything before you could read. A pause. Mr. Fenwick, Clara said. He has the office by the post. He smells like pipe tobacco. Elena wrote the name down. Good. She looked at Rowan, who had said nothing the entire 2 hours, just sat against the far wall and let her work. I need to go to the county seat, she said. That's 2 days' ride. Yes. The children. I'll arrange something. She rolled the documents carefully and handed them back. Don't go to Voss. Don't respond to him at all. Whatever he sends you, whatever he says, don't answer it. Let him think you're figuring out what to do. I don't like waiting. I know. But if he knows you're moving, he'll move faster, and he has more money and more people than you do. Your advantage is that he doesn't know what I'm going to do because he doesn't think of me as part of this. Rowan looked at her for a moment. You're going to make this your fight. He threw a jar of medicine against my wall and told me I had 30 days, Elena said. It was already my fight. Something shifted in Rowan's face. It wasn't surprise exactly, more like recognition, the look of a person who has been carrying something alone long enough that the moment someone else picks up part of it feels almost physically different. All right, he said quietly. She left for the county seat 4 days later, once she had arranged for Nora Calder, who owed her more than a favor now, to look after Clara and James for 2 nights. Clara received this information with the dignity of someone who was not going to complain about something she understood was necessary, which was how Clara received most hard things. James asked if he could go with her, and Elena said no, and James asked why, and Elena said because, and James knew from her tone that this was the end of the conversation, which he didn't like but accepted. The ride to the county seat was long and cold, and she had too much time to think. She thought about Rowan on his mountain with a 7-year-old boy and a house with holes in the east wall, spending every day of the past year and a half making sure the thing he'd built didn't fall apart. She thought about how Silas Voss had probably looked at that situation and seen exactly what he wanted to see, an isolated man, recently widowed, without allies. Alone. Easy. The thing about underestimating isolated people, Elena thought, is that sometimes the isolation is why they got strong in the first place. The county records office was a brown building with warped window frames and a clerk inside who looked at Elena with the particular weariness of a man who had learned that people who came to him with problems were never going to make his day easier. I need to see recent land survey filings for Blackridge Pass and the surrounding ridge area, she said. Specifically anything filed in the last 18 months under mining or prospecting claims. The clerk looked at her. That's a lot of material. I have time, she said, and sat down at the table he indicated with the posture of someone who was not going to leave until she had what she came for. It took the better part of 6 hours. The clerk brought files in installments, watching her with diminishing suspicion as it became clear she wasn't going to damage anything or steal it. She was just going to read it. All of it, carefully, making notes in a small book she'd brought from her clinic. What she found took her breath away for a moment, and then gave it back colder and sharper than before. There were 11 separate survey filings over the past 14 months, all in the Black Ridge corridor. 6 different surveyors listed, but when she compared the handwriting on the technical annotations, 3 of those 6 were the same person using different signatures. The coordinate adjustments were subtle, small enough that a casual review would miss them, large enough that in each case the affected property line moved north, consistently, universally north, always toward the ridge, always in the direction of the ore. And the registrar who had received and filed all 11 documents was Fenwick, the same man, every single one. She sat back in her chair and looked at her notes. This was not an error. This was a system. Someone had built a machine for stealing land one survey at a time, and they had built it carefully, and it had been running for over a year. She asked the clerk for one more thing before she left: the list of all landowners whose property boundaries had been affected by the surveys in question. He found it with visible reluctance, and she copied every name. There were 9 of them. 1 was Rowan Thorne. 8 were people she didn't know yet, but would. She rode back in weather that had turned mean. The wind had come around to the north, and it had teeth in it. And she arrived home in the early morning of the second day with her hands stiff and her notes tucked inside her coat against her chest. She went directly to her clinic, built the fire up, and laid out everything she'd copied on the workbench. Then she made the coffee Rowan had described as terrible and drank it black and cold and didn't taste any of it. When he arrived, she had sent a message ahead from a relay post. She showed him what she'd found. He stood at the workbench and read for a long time. She watched his face. He had a way of going very still when something was serious. The stillness was deeper than usual now. 9 families, he said. 9 that I could confirm. There may be more. Some people may have sold already, or given up the land without knowing why the survey said what it said. Hector Marsh, Rowan said. He's on the list. Rowan put down the papers. He put his hands flat on the workbench and looked at the wall above it. A long silence. What does this require, he said, to undo it? The fraudulent surveys need to be officially challenged. That means filing a counter-survey through a reputable surveyor, not Fenwick, and presenting evidence that the original filings were falsified. That means getting the other affected families to come forward. If it's one man alone, Voss's people can isolate him. If it's 9 families with documented evidence of a systematic fraud, she stopped, let him finish it. That's harder to bury, he said, and it exposes Fenwick, which is the thread that unravels the whole thing, because Fenwick received and filed fraudulent documents as county registrar. That's a criminal matter, not just a civil one. If we can show the pattern clearly enough, it's not Voss's word against yours anymore. It's a government inquiry. Rowan looked at her. Can you do this? I can start it, she said. I need you to ride to each of those 8 families. Show them what I found. Tell them what it means. Some of them won't want to fight. Some of them will be afraid. But some of them are going to be angry, he said. That's what I'm counting on, Elena said. The first 3 families were exactly what she'd expected. Afraid or already half resigned or worried that taking on a man with Voss's money meant destroying themselves in the process. She understood it. She didn't argue. She left copies of her findings and the names of the other families and let each person make their own decision. The 4th family was Gideon Hart, a rancher who had come west from Georgia 15 years ago and had a face like worn leather and eyes that missed very little. He read Elena's notes at his kitchen table while his wife refilled her coffee 3 times without asking, and when he was done, he put the papers down and looked at Rowan. How long have you known this woman? He asked. A few months, Rowan said. Gideon looked at Elena. How'd you pull all this from the county records? I looked, she said. Gideon was quiet for a moment. I am 71 years old, he said. I have been farming this land for going on 30 years. A man came here 18 months ago with a document that said my north boundary had been resurveyed and I had lost 19 acres. I hired a man in town to review it, and he told me the document appeared legitimate. He folded his hands on the table. I have been losing sleep over those 19 acres for a year and a half. They're still yours, Elena said. Legally, the survey that took them is fraudulent. Gideon Hart looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, What do you need from me? That was the moment. She felt it the way you feel the first solid ground after a long stretch of soft earth, the shift underfoot from uncertain to stable. A statement, she said, signed, detailing what you were told and when, the name of the man who surveyed you, what the document said. All of it. I can give you that today. And then we need you to contact the other ranchers in the valley. Not Voss's people, the working families. The ones who've been here long enough to remember what honest surveying looks like. If this goes to a formal inquiry, it's stronger with every respected voice it carries. Gideon nodded slowly. I know 6 men between here and the ridge who've been wondering why their north pastures started looking smaller, he said. Didn't add up. We talked about it, didn't know what to do with it. Now you do, Elena said. Gideon looked at Rowan. Your woman put this together. Rowan's expression carried something she hadn't seen before, not quite pride, which would have been the obvious thing, but something quieter and more specific. Like a man watching someone do something that reminded him the world was capable of more than he'd recently believed. She did, Rowan said. Elena looked at neither of them and wrote something in her notebook. She was not comfortable being talked about in the third person when she was sitting right there. But she had learned that certain old men needed to process information through the frame of the person they trusted, and Gideon Hart had just decided to trust Rowan, which meant Rowan was the frame, and she could manage being the frame's contents for the sake of getting done what needed doing. The complications arrived within a week. Someone had told Voss. She didn't know who. It might have been Fenwick, alerted to the records inquiry, or it might have been one of the 3 families who had declined to join the challenge. Either way, Voss moved fast, the way rich men do when they feel something closing in. He filed an injunction against 2 of the participating ranchers, claiming interference with a legal mining claim. He sent a letter to Elena's clinic, formal, from a lawyer 3 counties away, suggesting that her retrieval and distribution of county records for purposes of civil dispute constituted a form of legal interference. The letter was full of language designed to make her feel small and uncertain and over her head. She read it twice. She set it on the workbench. She went back to work. But that evening, when the clinic was empty and the children were in bed, she sat at that workbench alone, and the fear came. Not the performative kind that was really just caution, the real kind, the kind that lives low in the chest and reminds you that you are one person without money and without formal authority, and the man on the other side of this has both. It sat in her chest for about 20 minutes. She didn't try to argue it away. She had learned that arguing with real fear was useless. You had to let it say what it needed to say, and then decide what you were going to do anyway. What she was going to do was keep going. She had built a clinic from a feed shed. She had raised 2 children alone in a town that tolerated her. She had learned medicine from the ground up because no one was going to teach her any other way. She was not going to sit down because a man with money had sent her a letter with big words in it. She wrote to the lawyer in response, carefully and precisely, outlining what she had found, the nature of the documents, and the basis on which a formal challenge to the fraudulent surveys would proceed. She wrote it in plain language, not legal language, because she had learned that plain language was harder to bury under procedure than fancy language was. She said clearly that the evidence she had gathered would be submitted to the Territorial Land Authority within 30 days, and that she was prepared to present it in whatever formal setting required. She signed her name at the bottom. Elena Ashcroft. No title, no credential, just her name. Then Rowan's son Daniel came down off the mountain with his father one afternoon, and something happened that Elena hadn't planned for, and that changed the temperature of everything that followed. Rowan had told her he was going to talk to Daniel. She had believed him. She hadn't known when he'd do it or how, and she hadn't asked, because the conversation between a father and a 7-year-old boy about the death of his mother was not something that belonged to her, no matter how close she'd come to the edges of that family's life. But she was there when it landed. Daniel came into the clinic while Rowan was in town handling something at the supply store, and he sat down on the chair by the workbench, Rowan's chair, the one that was too small for Rowan. And he looked at Elena's labeled jars for a long time without speaking. Elena kept working. She had learned from Clara that sometimes children needed you to not look at them while they were deciding to tell you something. My dad told me about my mom, Daniel said finally. Elena set down what she was holding. Yeah? He told me everything. A pause. Even the parts he probably didn't want to. That sounds like your dad, she said. Daniel nodded. He looked at a jar. He said she was unhappy, he said. He said he didn't make her happy enough. A very long pause. He said the accident wasn't his fault, and it wasn't her fault. He said sometimes things happen, and no one is the reason. Elena sat down across from him, slowly, the way you move around something that might startle. "Do you believe him?" she asked. Daniel thought about it with genuine seriousness. 7 years old, and he thought about it the way an adult would, actually considering it, not just looking for the answer he was supposed to give. "I think so," he said. "I was mad for a while he was talking." He looked at her. "Is that bad?" "No," Elena said. "That's honest." He looked back at the jars. "Clara gets mad too," he said, "when something's not fair. I've seen her." "Clara gets very mad," Elena agreed. "She's good at it. I'm not as good at it." He said this like it was a simple fact. "I mostly get quiet instead." "Getting quiet isn't wrong," Elena said carefully, "but it shouldn't have to last forever." He nodded. He looked at his hands in his lap. "My dad seems better," he said. Since he comes here." He looked up at her without any particular shyness. "Are you going to stay?" The question hit her clean and direct the way only children's questions can, without the adult coating of implication or the courtesy of approaching from an angle. "I'm working on it," she said. He nodded as though this were a reasonable answer. "Okay," he said. James appeared in the doorway approximately 30 seconds later, loudly, wanting to know if Daniel could come look at something he'd found in the yard. Daniel slid off the chair. He paused at the door. "I'm glad he told me," he said. "Not to anyone in particular. To the room, maybe. Or to whatever had been sitting quiet inside him for a year and a half." Then he followed James outside, and Elena sat at the workbench alone for a moment, and she thought about what it cost a man to do that. To sit down with his 7-year-old son and take apart the story that the child had been carrying in his own damaged version, and tell it again, honest and full. To include the parts that made him look like an idiot, as she'd once said. Rowan had done that. She was still thinking about it when he came back from the supply store and found her at the workbench with nothing in her hands, just sitting. He looked at her face. "Daniel talked to you?" "A little," she said. He sat down. The chair complained. "How did he take it?" she asked. "Better than I deserved," he said quietly. She looked at him. "That's not the right way to think about it." "I know," he said. "I'm working on it." She almost smiled. She thought about the first morning he'd come through her door, and she'd told him the wound would hurt, and he'd said, "All right." The same quality in him then as now, making a performance of bearing them. "I found 2 more names," she said, shifting back to the work that had been sitting in front of her. "Families east of the Marsh property. Same pattern, different surveyor signature. I think there are at least 4 signatories total, all under Voss's direction." Rowan straightened. "How do you want to proceed?" "Carefully," she said. "Fast enough that he can't outmaneuver us. Careful enough that everything we present is watertight." He nodded. Then, "Elena." She looked up. "Whatever happens with this—" He stopped, tried again. "I want you to know that I understand what you're doing here isn't only about the land. I know it started as," he found the word carefully, "as something larger than the 2 of us. But I want you to know I see it." She held his gaze. The late afternoon light was the same color it had been the first time she'd stood in his kitchen, gold and low. "The land matters," she said. "The mountain matters. Those children matter." She paused. "You matter." It was the most direct thing she had said to him that wasn't about documents or wounds or next steps. He heard it the way he heard everything, without deflection, without rushing to fill the space it left behind. Outside, James shouted something, and Daniel's voice came back, short and flat. And then James laughed. Rowan glanced at the window. "He's talking more," he said. "I noticed. He wasn't before." "I know," Elena said. They sat in the clinic that was starting to feel like less of her place alone and more of a place where things happened that mattered to more than just her. And outside the first real winter dark was settling over Blackridge Pass. And somewhere to the north, Silas Voss was making his next calculation. And Elena had a stack of documents on her workbench and a list of 9 families and a legal letter she'd already answered, and she was not finished. Not even close. The letter from Voss's lawyer arrived on a Tuesday, which Elena had come to think of as the worst day of the week for bad news, because Tuesday was the day she restocked her supplies and did her accounts. And bad news on a Tuesday meant the rest of the week started already behind. This letter was different from the first one. The first had been a warning dressed in legal language. This one was a notice of formal proceedings. Voss had filed a claim with the Territorial Land Authority asserting prior mining rights over the North Ridge Corridor, citing the fraudulent surveys as supporting documentation, and requesting that all counterfilings be suspended pending review. The review, conveniently, would be conducted by a panel that included two officials Elena had already noted as being connected to Fenwick through a chain of appointments that was not quite obvious unless you were looking for it. She read the letter 3 times. Then she set it on the workbench next to her notes and looked at the ceiling for about 30 seconds. The thing Voss understood, she realized, was timing, not just the strategy, the timing. He had waited until she had assembled enough of a case to look credible, and then he had moved to cut the ground out from under the review process itself. If the panel was compromised, it didn't matter how clean her evidence was. The machine would simply process it and produce the result he'd paid for. She needed to go above the panel. She needed someone outside Fenwick's web of favors and appointments. The question was who? Rowan arrived an hour later. She handed him the letter without preamble. He read it standing up, which he often did when something required his full attention. He seemed to think better on his feet, which she had stopped finding strange. She thought better with her hands busy. People had their methods. He set the letter down. He's trying to lock us out of the process. He's already started, she said. The panel review is his kill. If it goes there, the evidence doesn't matter. Then we don't go there. We have to go somewhere, she said. We can't just sit on the evidence. He'll use the time. Rowan thought. She could see him working through it the same way he'd worked through the decision to come to her clinic that first morning, methodically, without panic, but without the false calm that was really just avoidance. He actually thought. Judge Alderman, he said finally. Elena looked at him. The circuit judge? He rode through here 8 years ago, stayed 3 nights while he handled a property dispute between 2 families north of the pass. I helped him get his wagon out of a ditch. Rowan paused. He's not a dramatic man, but he's honest, and he's territorial. He doesn't like when someone tries to sidestep his jurisdiction with a panel arrangement. Do you know where he's sitting right now? No, but I know who would. He looked at her. Owen Greer, the magistrate in Delaware. He and Alderman go back 20 years. Delaware was 4 hours north. Elena looked at her schedule on the wall. 3 patients tomorrow morning, 1 in the afternoon, and Nora Calder had said she would take the children on Thursday if Elena needed it. I can go Thursday, she said. I'll go, Rowan said. You've done the county seat. Let me do this one. She looked at him. The offer was genuine. Not an attempt to take over, not a man deciding to handle things because he didn't trust a woman to manage them. He was trying to carry part of it, which was a different thing entirely. Alderman won't know you, she said. He needs to know the case. You need to take everything I've documented in order, and you need to be able to answer questions about each piece. Then help me understand it well enough to answer them. They spent that evening at her workbench, going through every document, every notation, every line of the chain she had built from the county records. I was a quick study. She had suspected as much. A man who ran 400 acres alone couldn't afford to be slow at understanding things. He asked good questions, the kind that came from genuinely trying to understand rather than trying to seem like he was following along. At one point, Clara drifted in from upstairs, ostensibly for water, and stood in the doorway looking at the 2 of them hunched over papers in the lamplight, and said nothing for a moment and then went back upstairs. And Elena heard her daughter's footsteps on the ceiling, soft and unhurried, like someone who had seen something that confirmed a thing they'd already thought. By 10 o'clock, Rowan knew the case as well as Elena did. Maybe not the legal architecture of it, but the facts, the names, the dates, the pattern, the specific fraudulent signatures, the chain of reception through Fenwick. He could walk someone through it clearly. One more thing, Elena said before he left. She pulled a separate page from beneath the stack, a letter she had written and rewritten 3 times that day. This is for Alderman directly, not through Greer. Give it to him if he agrees to hear you. Rowan took it. He looked at the outside of the folded paper. Her name was written at the bottom in the same plain script as the letter she'd sent to Voss's lawyer. What does it say? He asked. That this isn't only about 9 families and a mountain, she said. That if a mining operation can falsify surveys and compromise a county registrar and then use a purchased review panel to legalize the result, then no frontier deed is safe. Anyone's land, anyone's boundary. She paused. I told him that's the kind of thing that tends to define a judge's career, whether he stepped in or whether he let it happen. Rowan looked at the letter. You're asking him to care about his legacy. I'm pointing out that he has one, she said. What he does with that is up to him. Rowan left before midnight. Elena stood in the clinic after he'd gone and looked at the space where the papers had been spread out, now squared and stacked and organized. Thomas's shelf was directly above the workbench, his handwriting on every label, and she looked at it for a moment the way she sometimes did. Not with grief exactly, not anymore, but with a kind of acknowledgement. I see you. I still see you. Then she turned out the lamp and went upstairs. Rowan was back in 4 days. Not 2. 4. She didn't let herself worry until the 3rd day, and then she let herself worry a moderate amount, and on the morning of the 4th day, his horse came up the road in the thin, early light, and she watched from the window without going to the door until she could see his face. He looked tired. He also looked like a man who had accomplished something. She went to the door. Alderman's in Carver City, he said, before he was fully through the door. 3-day session ending Friday. Greer sent a message ahead. Alderman will receive a formal filing. He sat down heavily in the chair by the workbench. He's honest. Greer was right about that. He spent 40 minutes reading through what I brought him and asking questions that told me he already understood the problem before he finished reading. Did he respond to the letter? Rowan reached into his coat and produced the folded paper she had written. It had been opened and refolded. On the outside, below her name, a single line had been written in a different hand. File by Friday. Be thorough. Elena looked at it. Something that was almost relief moved through her, but she held it back because relief this early was a dangerous thing. It made you careless. We have 4 days, she said. I know. I need Gideon Hart's signed statement and the statements from at least 3 of the other families. I need the original survey documents, my comparative analysis, and the notes on Fenwick's signature chain. Hart already sent his statement, Rowan said. Arrived yesterday morning. He also sent one from a man named Birch, who farms east of him. Apparently Birch has been sitting on a letter he received from Fenwick's office 18 months ago that he never quite understood. It amounts to a written admission that the resurvey was initiated at Voss's request. Elena stared at him. Fenwick put that in writing? Fenwick put it in writing, Rowan confirmed with the flat satisfaction of a man who has found a loose thread and watched it unravel further than expected. She sat down. She exhaled slowly. He was confident no one would ever connect it, she said. Or he was careless, either way. Either way, Rowan agreed. They worked through the next 3 days with the focused, grinding thoroughness of 2 people who understand that what they're building has to hold weight. Elena organized the documents into a formal presentation, not the legal language she didn't have, but the clear sequential logic she did have, the kind that didn't require a law degree to follow. She wrote the comparative analysis of the fraudulent survey signatures cleanly, demonstrating with the coordinate notations themselves that the adjustments were deliberate and consistent, not random errors. She included Fenwick's letter as a separate exhibit, clearly labeled, with a written explanation of its significance that didn't editorialize, just stated what it showed. Gideon Hart came into town on the 2nd day, uninvited but not unwelcome, with 2 other ranchers she hadn't met. An older woman named Ruth Beaumont, who had lost her eastern pasture to a resurvey and had spent a year thinking she'd misread her own deed, and a younger man named Cord Vasquez, who had bought his land 8 years ago and had documentation going back to the original filing that conclusively contradicted the resurvey results. Ruth brought dried apples and set them on the workbench without a word, then sat down and asked what she could do. Cord spread his documentation on the floor because the workbench was full and got to work cross-referencing on his hands and knees without complaint. Clara watched all of this from the stairs. James watched it from inside the room because James had no capacity for watching things from a distance. He planted himself next to Cord Vasquez and asked 3 questions about the documents before Elena told him, gently but definitely, to go find something else to occupy himself. Daniel was there too, brought by Rowan, and he and Clara sat on the stairs together in the afternoon of the 2nd day, not talking much, watching the adults work. At one point, Clara handed Daniel a piece of Ruth Beaumont's dried apple, and he ate it and said thank you in the particular formal way he had, and Clara looked at the workbench and said quietly, just between the 2 of them, My mom's going to fix it. Daniel looked at her. Yeah, he said. I think so too. Clara nodded. Like that settled it. Elena didn't hear this exchange. She heard about it later, from Clara, who told it in a matter-of-fact way that made it clear she was simply reporting information rather than making an emotional statement, which was how Clara said almost everything that actually mattered to her. The filing went out on Friday morning, carried by the fastest rider Rowan could hire, with a duplicate sent separately so that if one was delayed or interfered with, the other would arrive. Elena had thought about that, the possibility that Voss had people watching the roads. She didn't know if he did. She wasn't willing to find out the hard way. Then they waited. Waiting was the part she was worst at. She kept the clinic running, kept seeing patients, kept doing everything that needed doing. But underneath all of it was the particular tension of a person who has done everything within their power and reached the boundary of what they can control. The rest was Alderman's. The rest was the territorial process, which she had put her faith in not because she naively believed it was perfect, but because it was the lever they had, and you worked with the lever you had. Voss made his own move on the fourth day of waiting. He came to the clinic himself this time. Not his lawyer, not the men with survey stakes, Voss himself, in the late afternoon, and he came alone, which she hadn't expected. He was a compact man, well-dressed in the frontier way, expensive without being flashy, everything chosen for function but chosen with money. He had a face that knew how to be pleasant. That was the thing she noticed first. He was genuinely capable of looking pleasant, which made him more dangerous than the kind of man who could only manage threatening. "Mrs. Ashcroft," he said, from just inside the door. "I wonder if I might have a word." Elena was alone. The children were at the Calders. Rowan was at the supply store, not expecting trouble at this particular moment. She looked at Voss. She had thought about this meeting, or one like it, since the beginning. She'd thought about what she would feel and what she would do. She had expected to feel fear. What she felt instead was something more like the quality of attention that came over her when she opened a wound. Very still, very focused, taking in information. "Word about what?" she said. Not a question. A signal that she wasn't going to perform ignorance. He stepped further into the room. "I think we may have gotten off to a poor start," he said pleasantly. "What happened here earlier? The jar, the 30 days. I want you to know that was a communication I should have handled more carefully. My man overstepped." "Your man was you," Elena said. "I know who threw that jar." His pleasant expression held. "I'd like to find a resolution that doesn't require a prolonged legal process, for everyone's sake." "What kind of resolution?" He looked around the clinic with the assessing expression of a man who had looked at many things and assigned them values. "I'm prepared to offer the affected families fair market compensation for the boundary adjustments. More than fair. No one loses their house, no one loses their primary acreage. The North Corridor land is what the mining operation requires, and frankly, it's been underused. Everyone walks away better than they came in." Elena said nothing. "There's also the matter of your clinic," he continued. "The building you're in belongs to the holding company that owns this block. The lease comes up in spring. I can arrange for that lease to be secured long-term, at a rate that won't change, regardless of what happens with the land claims." She looked at him. She had known the building issue was coming. She had always known the lease was a vulnerability. He had done his research. "What you're offering," she said carefully, "is payment for land that was stolen, plus a promise that you won't also steal the roof over my clinic." His pleasant expression flickered. Not much, but she caught it. "I'd characterize it differently." "I know you would," she said. "Here's what I'd like you to understand, Mr. Voss. I'm not doing this for the compensation. I'm not doing it for the lease. I'm doing it because what you built here, the surveys, the registrar, the panel arrangement, is a machine for taking land from people who don't have the resources to fight you. And if it works once, it will work again. And somewhere down that road, there are families who lose everything they spent their lives building, and they never even know why." She paused. "That machine needs to stop." The pleasantness was mostly gone now. What was underneath it was not as interesting, just the flat, calculating expression of a man recalibrating. "You filed with Alderman," he said. "Statement, not question." "Yes." "You understand what that means. Even if Alderman reviews, even if he finds in your favor on some of this, the legal process is long. You'll be in proceedings for months, years possibly. That's a long time for a woman running a clinic alone to be under legal pressure. I imagine it is, she said. I'm not threatening you, he said, and the particular way he said it made clear that he understood she would hear it as a threat regardless, and he didn't particularly care. I know, she said. You don't need to threaten. You've already tried to make the alternative to accepting your offer uncomfortable enough that I would accept it rather than fight. That's what the lawyer's letter was. That's what the panel arrangement was. You're very good at building the room until there's only one door. He looked at her for a long moment. The problem, she said, is that I've spent 3 years living in a room where there was only one door. I got pretty comfortable with it. She walked to her workbench and picked up the work she'd been doing before he arrived. If you'll excuse me, I have preparations to finish before tomorrow morning. He stood there for a moment longer than she'd expected. She kept her eyes on the workbench. Then he left. She stood very still for about 10 seconds after the door closed, her hands on the workbench, and she felt the adrenaline move through her, and she breathed through it and let it pass. Then she picked up where she'd left off. Rowan found out what had happened when he came by that evening. She told him plainly what Voss had offered, what she'd said, how he'd left. Rowan's jaw was tight by the end of it. He came here alone. He wanted it to be private, she said. He's used to negotiations that stay private. You should have sent for me. She looked at him, not unkindly, but directly. No. He absorbed that. He didn't like it, she could see that, but he was capable of understanding the difference between a situation that required him and a situation he wanted to be in because the thought of her alone with that man made him uncomfortable. Those were different things. All right, he said, with an effort that she appreciated because he didn't hide that it was an effort. He knows we filed with Alderman, she said. He's going to move fast. Whatever he has left to do to shore up the panel arrangement and get ahead of the review, he'll do it in the next 10 days. Then we need Alderman to move faster. We need the other families to make noise, she said. Not violent noise, visible noise. Gideon Hart talking to people. Ruth Beaumont talking to people. Cord Vasquez going to every rancher in the valley who's had a survey in the last 2 years and asking them to look at their northern boundary. She paused. Voss wins when it's 9 families alone against his apparatus. He doesn't win when the whole valley is asking questions. Rowan nodded slowly. Hart will do it. He's been wanting to do it since the first meeting. Tell him to start tomorrow, she said. What followed was the longest 10 days of Elena's adult life, which was a significant statement given that she had spent 18 months after Thomas died learning how to breathe through a grief that sometimes felt structural, like something had been taken out of her actual chest. Gideon Hart talked. Ruth Beaumont talked. Cord Vasquez did exactly what Elena had suggested and spent 4 days riding from property to property, and the number of ranchers who had noticed boundary discrepancies. They hadn't been able to explain grew from 9 to 14, then to 16. Not all of them were willing to file. Some were too afraid of Voss's economic reach, his ability to make purchases difficult and supplies inconvenient through the trading operations he controlled. But they talked to each other, and they talked to the people who were filing, and the conversation grew loud enough that it stopped being something Voss could quietly manage. A reporter from the territorial paper showed up on day 6. Elena did not know who had told him, and she had her suspicions but didn't pursue them. He was a young man with a sharp face and a notebook who asked good questions and was clearly more interested in what had actually happened than in what the story was supposed to be. She answered his questions carefully, showed him the documents she was permitted to show, and told him what she could not show him and why. He wrote it down. "You're a healer," he said, near the end. "Not a lawyer. How did you know what to look for in the county records?" She thought about how to answer that. "I've been looking at things that were wrong and figuring out why since I was 17, she said. "It doesn't matter what the subject is. Wrong is wrong. It has a pattern." The article ran 3 days later. She didn't see it immediately. A copy made its way to Blackridge Pass a day after publication, and Rowan brought it to her, and she read it at the workbench with the same focus she gave a document she was trying to understand. The headline called her a frontier healer. She thought that was probably accurate enough. The article described the fraud clearly, cited the key documents, named Fenwick, which took some courage from the paper's editor, she suspected, and laid out the scope of the scheme in terms any ranching family in the territory could understand. By the end of that week, the Territorial Land Authority had received formal objections from 12 ranching families and a letter of concern signed by 19 community figures, including 3 former county officials whose names carried weight. And then Alderman's clerk sent word. The review panel arrangement had been suspended. Alderman had assumed direct jurisdiction over the matter, citing irregularities in the panel composition that represented a conflict of interest. A formal hearing would be scheduled. The fraudulent survey filings were temporarily frozen pending review. The mining operation on the North Ridge corridor was halted. Elena read the message twice. She was sitting at the workbench alone when it arrived. The clinic was empty, the children at school, Rowan up on the mountain dealing with something on the property that needed his hands. She sat in the quiet and read the message twice, and then she set it down and looked at Thomas's shelf. She didn't say anything. She just looked at it. After a while, she got up and made coffee. Not the terrible kind Rowan made, but decent coffee. The kind she made when she had time to do it right. And she stood at the window with it and looked at the street outside and thought about the morning Voss had walked in and thrown a jar against the wall. 30 days, he had said. She thought about what 30 days had actually produced, and she felt something she hadn't let herself feel through any of it. Not triumph, exactly, but something quieter and more sustainable. The particular satisfaction of a person who has done a hard thing correctly, who has carried something to the place it needed to go. She was still standing at the window when Clara came home from school, an hour earlier than expected, and stopped in the doorway and looked at her mother's face with that careful, hawk-like attention. "What happened?" Clara asked. Elena turned around. "The judge stopped the mining operation," she said, "pending the full hearing." Clara looked at her. She processed this with the seriousness she brought to all significant information. "Does that mean the mountain is safe?" she asked. "For now," Elena said. "The hearing still has to happen. There's still work to do." Clara came into the room and put her school bag on the chair. "But we're winning." "We're winning," Elena agreed. Clara nodded. She sat down. She opened her bag and took out her schoolwork without another word, settling into the afternoon quiet of the clinic with the ease of a child who had decided, somewhere along the way without making an announcement about it, that this was a place she belonged. Elena watched her daughter for a moment. Then she went back to work. Because the hearing was still coming, and Fenwick had not yet been formally charged, and Voss had money and lawyers and the ability to make the process long and expensive and wearing in ways that hadn't shown themselves yet. She knew that. She was not naive about it, but she also knew this. The machine had been seen. The fraudulent surveys were frozen. The weight of 16 families and a territorial judge and a newspaper article was sitting on top of Silas Voss's carefully constructed apparatus, and that weight was not going anywhere. She thought about Rowan on his mountain, probably not knowing yet, probably working with his hands on whatever had needed fixing, the east wing still open to the sky. She thought, he said it isn't finished. She thought, but it's still standing. And she sat down at the workbench and pulled the next document toward her and kept going. The hearing was set for the second week of December, which gave them 3 weeks and not a day more to make sure everything that needed to be in place was in place. Elena spent the first of those weeks doing something she hadn't done enough of through the whole process. She slept. Not well, and not long, but more than the 4 and 5 hour stretches she'd been surviving on since October. Her body had apparently been waiting for a moment when the most urgent pressure eased slightly, and the moment Alderman's clerk message arrived, it sent a bill she hadn't known was accumulating. She woke up the morning after the news feeling like she'd been worked over, and she sat on the edge of the bed for a full minute before standing, which was unusual for her. She was a fast-rising person. She had trained herself into it. Clara appeared in the doorway. "You slept late." "I know. It's past 7. "I'm aware, Clara." Clara leaned against the doorframe. "Daniel's father is here." Elena looked at her. "It's past 7 and Rowan is already here." "He brought wood," Clara said. "He's stacking it in the back." Elena stood up. She could hear it now. The particular rhythm of someone stacking wood, the knock and settle of split timber finding its place. She dressed and went downstairs and out the back door into the cold morning. And Rowan was there in the gray light working through a load of wood he had apparently brought down from the mountain on a wagon she could see at the edge of the alley. He had already been at it for a while. The stack was half done. He looked up when she appeared. "You were asleep," he said. "I didn't want to knock." She stood in the cold doorway looking at him. "You drove down from the mountain this morning to stack wood before I was awake." "You're going to need it for December." What you have isn't enough. She watched him set another piece. Rowan. It's wood, Elena. It's not complicated. She was quiet for a moment. She thought about what it meant. Not the wood itself, but the fact that he had looked at her situation and identified a gap and done something about it without asking whether she needed it or wanted it or was capable of getting it herself. Not because he thought she couldn't, because he could, and so he did. That was a different thing. She had spent enough of her life around the other kind to know the difference without needing to think about it. "Thank you," she said. He nodded and kept working. She went inside and made coffee and brought him a cup when the stack was done, and they stood in the cold alley and drank it, and the morning light came up slow and pale over the rooftops. "Alderman's people contacted me yesterday," Rowan said. "They want the original deed and the 1871 survey as primary documentation. I have them. Bring them to me before the hearing. I want to cross-reference the coordinates one more time against what I submitted." "All right." He drank his coffee. "Fenwick hasn't shown up for work at the county office since Thursday." Elena looked at him. "How do you know that?" "Hart has a cousin who works the land records office 2 days a week. Word travels." Fenwick had disappeared. That was either very good or complicated, depending on what disappeared meant. A man who ran because he was scared was a man who couldn't testify in Voss's defense. But a man who disappeared could also mean documents disappeared with him, and documents were the spine of everything she'd built. "The copies," she said. "I was thinking the same thing," Rowan said. "What did you keep?" "Everything. Every original I was permitted to take, I kept. Every document I only read, I transcribed by hand into my notes. 3 copies of each set. One with you, one with me, one with Gideon Hart." He looked at her with something that was not quite surprise. "When did you make 3 sets?" "Before I made 2, she said. "The first thing I did when I got back from the county seat was make copies, before I showed anyone anything." He was quiet for a moment. "You thought someone might try to make the evidence disappear." "I thought it was possible," she said. "Rich men have long arms." He drank the last of his coffee. "I'm glad one of us was thinking that far ahead." "You were thinking about the land and the legal challenge," she said. "I was thinking about what could go wrong. Between the two of us, we covered the ground." He looked at her with that quality she'd seen in him since nearly the beginning. The particular stillness of a person who was listening not just to the words, but to what was underneath them. He had understood from very early on that she was not someone who needed managing or rescuing, and he had chosen not to do either of those things, and she was still surprised, on the days she let herself think about it, by how much space that had given her to actually trust him. "I need to ask you something," he said. His voice had shifted, still quiet, but with the deliberateness that meant he'd been carrying the sentence for a while. She looked at him. He was looking at his empty cup, then at her. "The hearing is going to settle the land," he said. "Whatever Alderman decides, it's going to settle it one way or another. And I think we've done enough that it's going to settle it right." He paused. "But I don't want to wait for the land to ask you the question I've been not asking you." The alley was very cold and very quiet. "I'm not good at the kind of talking that goes around the thing," he said. "You know that about me by now, so I'm going to say it directly." He held her gaze. "Marry me. Not because of the mountain or the children or any practical reason, though all of those matter. Because I have spent the better part of this year watching you work, and I don't want to spend the rest of it watching from a distance." Elena looked at him for a moment. The pale winter light was on his face, and he looked exactly like what he was. A tired, honest, imperfect man who had been doing his best alone for a long time, and was asking, plainly, to stop doing it alone. She thought about the morning he'd first come through her door sideways because he was too large for the frame. She thought about the chair that was too small for him, and the way he'd sat in it without complaint. She thought about Daniel saying, "I think so too," on the stairs. She thought about Clara handing him the difficult question about the holes in his house and him answering it straight. She thought about Thomas's shelf upstairs, with the careful handwriting on every label. She thought, "I still see you. I will always still see you. And I think you would have told me to stop standing in the cold alley and answer the man." "Yes," she said. Rowan exhaled, a slow, controlled exhale that told her he had not been as certain of the answer as he'd appeared. She appreciated that. A man who was certain of an answer before he asked wasn't really asking. "All right," he said. All right, she agreed. They stood in the cold another moment. Neither of them was the kind of person who needed to fill a moment like that with more words than it required. Then James appeared at the back door in his socks, which Elena had told him approximately 300 times was not appropriate footwear for a doorstep in December, and said loudly, "Are you two just standing out here?" And the moment became something else, which was fine, because some moments are large enough on their own without needing to be extended. The hearing took place on a gray Thursday in the second week of December in Carver City, in a room that smelled like old paper and wood smoke and the particular anxiety of people waiting for decisions that will change their lives. Elena sat at the long table to the left of the chamber with Rowan beside her, and Gideon Hart and Ruth Beaumont and Cord Vasquez ranged along the bench behind them, along with 6 other affected families who had made the journey. Voss sat at the table to the right with 2 lawyers, both better dressed than anyone else in the room, both with the practiced composure of men who had done this many times before. Judge Alderman was not what Elena had expected, though she had not formed a specific picture. He was older than she'd imagined, late 60s, with a compact, deliberate energy and eyes that moved through a room the way hers did, cataloging and assessing. He read documents quickly and asked precise questions, and did not appear to be interested in performance from either side. He was interested in facts. Elena had brought facts. She presented the case herself, which she had not initially planned to do. She had planned to let the documentation speak and supplement it with written testimony. But when Voss's lawyer opened with a characterization of her evidence as amateur compilation by an unlicensed individual with personal interest in the outcome, Alderman had looked at her over his glasses and said, "Mrs. Ashcroft, would you like to address your methodology directly?" And she had stood up. She walked through everything methodically. The original survey records, the comparative coordinate analysis, the pattern of northern boundary adjustments that held consistent across 11 separate filings, the 4 fraudulent signatures she had identified as belonging to fewer than 4 actual individuals, the chain of reception through Fenwick's office, the letter in Fenwick's own hand that had been sitting in Cord Vasquez's file box for 18 months because he hadn't understood its significance until she'd explained it to him. She did not editorialize. She did not characterize Voss. She let the pattern speak because the pattern was more damning than anything she could say about him. And she had learned that damning facts presented quietly hit harder than damning facts presented with anger. Voss's lawyers objected 3 times. Alderman overruled twice and sustained once on a technicality she'd anticipated and prepared for. The proceedings lasted 2 full days. On the morning of the second day, something happened that she hadn't planned on and couldn't have arranged. Fenwick appeared. He came in at 9:30, accompanied by a man Elena didn't recognize who turned out to be his own legal counsel, and he sat in the witness area with the particular smallness of a man who has spent 2 weeks understanding what is about to happen to him, and has decided that the only path forward is the one that takes him partially through rather than the one that takes him down entirely. He testified for 4 hours. He named Voss directly. He described the arrangement, the money that had changed hands, the number of surveys he had received and filed knowing they were fraudulent, the instruction he had received about the panel composition for the original review. He was not brave about it. He shook in places and contradicted himself twice and had to be corrected from his own written records. He was not a man doing the right thing from principle. He was a man doing the only remaining thing that might reduce the consequence he was facing. But his testimony was true. Elena could tell because it matched precisely, on every verifiable point, what she had already documented. A man making things up to save himself invents things that cast him in the best light. Fenwick didn't invent anything. He just told what had happened, badly and with visible shame, and every fact he named was a fact she had already found in the records. When it was over, she sat very still at the table with her hands folded in front of her and looked at the middle distance and thought about 9 families, 16 by the time it was all tallied, who had spent months or years wondering why their land felt smaller, or who had already sold at a loss and moved on, and would now have to learn retroactively what had been done to them. That part didn't feel like victory. She wanted to be clear with herself about that. A thing can be the right outcome and still carry the weight of everything it costs to get there. Alderman issued his initial ruling the following morning. The fraudulent surveys were invalidated, all 11 of them. Every affected property boundary was to be restored to its original recorded coordinates. The mining operation on the North Ridge corridor was permanently halted pending a full investigation into the legality of the mining claim itself, which, with the survey documentation invalidated, had no remaining legal foundation. Fenwick was suspended from his position pending criminal proceedings. The matter was referred to the territorial attorney for investigation of potential conspiracy charges against Voss and any associates connected to the survey falsification scheme. Voss's lawyers filed an immediate appeal. Elena had expected that. Alderman looked at the appeal filing with the expression of a man who had been doing this for 40 years and set it aside for processing through the appropriate channels, which meant it would take time, months probably. But the initial ruling stood while the appeal was pending, and the mining operation stayed stopped, and the land stayed as it was. She stood in the hallway outside the chamber afterward with Gideon Hart on one side and Ruth Beaumont on the other, and Rowan somewhere behind her, and she looked at the wall across from her and said nothing for a moment. Hart put a hand briefly on her shoulder. "Well done," he said, the same directness he'd shown the first day she'd laid her notes out at his kitchen table. "It's not finished," she said. "No," he agreed, "but the machine is broken." She thought about that. He was right. Voss might appeal, might fight, might find some other angle. Men like Voss were not stopped by single rulings. They were slowed, and slowing was sometimes the best available outcome. But the machine, the systematic, invisible mechanism of fraudulent surveys and captured registrars and purchase panels, that was broken. It was visible now, named now, examined now, and a machine that everyone can see cannot keep running in the dark. Ruth Beaumont said, without any particular sentiment, "I'm getting those 19 acres back." "You're getting them back," Elena confirmed. Ruth nodded once, like they'd agreed on the weather, and walked down the hallway to find her wagon. The ride home from Carver City took longer than it should have because the weather had come in mean from the north and the road was ice in places, and Rowan drove carefully, which added an hour. The children were in the back of the wagon under blankets, Clara reading what little light remained and James asleep against Daniel's shoulder, which was itself something Elena noted. James had never fallen asleep against anyone outside the immediate family, and Daniel was sitting very still so as not to wake him, with the patient attention of a child who understood that another person's rest was worth protecting. She sat up front with Rowan, and they didn't talk much, the way they didn't talk much when silence was sufficient. At some point, with the dark coming in around the wagon and the horses steady on the frozen road, Rowan said, "The East Wing." She looked at him. "I want to finish it before spring," he said. "If we're doing this before winter's out, there needs to be more room." She looked at the road ahead. "What were you planning for that wing?" "Originally a workroom, storage." He paused. "It could be a proper room, too, if the layout's right." "Clara will want her own space," Elena said. "She won't say so, but she will." "I figured." He shifted the reins. "James will want to be near Daniel." "James will want to be inside whatever room Daniel is in," she said. "You can tell Daniel he's allowed to close a door." Rowan made a sound that was almost a laugh. Not quite, but almost. She'd learned to hear the almost laughs. They were as real as the actual ones, just more contained. "There's a ceremony to consider," she said. "I don't want anything large. I don't want a production." "Neither do I." "People will expect something." "People can expect what they like," he said. "When have you let what people expect change what you actually did?" She thought about that for a moment. He had a point. "Fair," she said. They were married 3 weeks later, on a Saturday morning in early January when the snow on the mountain was deep enough that Rowan had to break trail for the wagon on the upper road. The ceremony was at the homestead, which had a practical logic. It was where they would live, and the people who mattered could get there, and there was no reason to be married somewhere other than the place being married was for. Gideon Hart came. Ruth Beaumont came. The Calders came. Pete's hand still wrapped, but healing. A handful of families from the valley who had become something closer to allies than neighbors over the course of the past months. Nora Calder cried, which surprised Elena, because Nora seemed like a woman who had long ago made peace with her tear ducts staying in their proper place. "I don't know why I'm crying," Nora said, practically, "because you're both clearly going to be fine." "We're going to be fine," Elena agreed. "I know. That's what's making me cry." Elena had worn the dress she owned that fit best, which was a practical navy that she'd put on for exactly 3 significant occasions in her life. It wasn't new, it wasn't fancy. It fit her correctly, which seemed like the most important thing a dress could do for a person. And she had stopped apologizing for having a practical relationship with clothes somewhere in the second year after Thomas died. Rowan had put on a jacket that she suspected he'd borrowed from Hart because it fit him better than anything she'd seen him in, and his boots were clean, and he'd done something with his hair that she couldn't quite identify, but that suggested an effort. And the whole effect was a man who had taken the occasion seriously without turning himself into someone else for it. Clara stood beside Elena. Daniel stood beside Rowan. James stood between the two groups because he couldn't decide which side he belonged to, which was, Elena thought, the most accurate possible position for James to occupy. The words were simple, short, an exchange of intentions rather than a performance. When they were done, Rowan looked at her the way he'd looked at her the first morning in the clinic, steady, taking her in completely, without performance or deflection. And she looked back at him the same way, and that was enough. Some things don't need to be large to be permanent. After the ceremony, Clara made her way to Daniel and said something to him in an undertone that Elena couldn't hear. Daniel looked at her, then at Rowan, then at Elena, and then he nodded once, with the seriousness of someone who has been asked something significant and has given it real consideration. Later, Elena asked Clara what she'd said. "I told him we were going to be okay," Clara said. "What did he say?" "He said he thought so too." Clara paused. "He said he thought so for a while." Elena looked at her daughter, this serious, fierce, quietly loving child who had made her own assessment of Rowan Thorne on the day she'd asked him about the holes in his house, and had been sitting with that assessment for months, holding it close, making sure. "And what do you think?" she asked, "now that it's actually happened?" Clara considered the question with genuine seriousness, the way she did everything. "I think he's not Dad," she said carefully. "He's not trying to be Dad. He's different." She paused. "But he's good." Elena put her arm around her daughter. Clara leaned into it slightly. Not much, because Clara was economical with her affections in physical form, but enough. "Yes," Elena said. "He is." They moved into the mountain house in the last days of January, which was not a smooth or easy process. It was 4 trips with the wagon in bitter cold, and James lost a boot in the snow on the second trip, and they had to stop and find it. And on the third trip, Clara sat in the back holding the box that contained Thomas's labeled jars as carefully as if it were something that could break, which, to Elena, said everything about her daughter that needed saying. The shelf went up on the kitchen wall, Thomas's handwriting intact on every label. Rowan helped her hang it, and he didn't ask about it, and she didn't explain it, and it sat where it sat. And that was the end of the question. The east wing was finished by March. Rowan worked on it through February in the cold, which was miserable, and Elena helped when she could and stayed out of the way when she couldn't. Clara got the room she didn't ask for. She carried her things in with the dignity of someone who had decided to be understated about receiving something they had wanted, which was, Elena suspected, how Clara was going to be about good things her whole life. Daniel and James shared the other room, which Elena had expected to be a source of conflict given the difference in their personalities. What actually happened was that Daniel tolerated James's noise with a patience that suggested he had decided James was the equivalent of a loud but harmless natural phenomenon, like wind, and James in turn had developed a habit of going genuinely quiet when Daniel needed quiet, which was the single most disciplined thing James had ever done in his life, and suggested that the right person could bring the right behavior out of a child that the wrong approach would never reach. She kept the clinic in Blackridge Pass 3 days a week, and saw patients in the settlements closer to the ridge the other days. Rowan built her a proper kit case from good timber, fitted with compartments she'd specified herself, that she could carry on horseback. She was treating more people than she had before, which made a kind of rough sense. The mountain gave her a broader reach, and she used it. The appeal Voss filed moved through the territorial courts with the grinding slowness of official processes, and in April came news that the territorial attorney had opened a full criminal investigation into the survey fraud scheme. The investigation was not limited to the Blackridge Ridge corridor. It expanded, as Elena had believed it would, into the broader pattern of Voss's land acquisition operations across the territory. Other families, in other counties, other corridors, began to surface with the same story. The visit from the surveyor, the letter from the county office, the shrinking boundary they hadn't been able to explain. Gideon Hart wrote her a letter when the investigation was announced. It was short. "You said the machine needed to stop. I believe it has stopped. Thank you for seeing what the rest of us were too close to see." She kept the letter. Fenwick was charged in May. He accepted a plea arrangement that required his full cooperation with the criminal investigation. Voss's lead lawyer withdrew from the case in June, which was its own kind of signal. By summer, the appeal was moving toward a resolution that Voss's remaining lawyers appeared to have no real expectation of winning, and the Northridge corridor was still halted, and every affected family's land boundary had been formally restored. The mountain stayed exactly where it had always been. Rowan finished the porch in July, the boards he'd replaced, the sections that had been missing since before Elena had ever set foot on the property. He did it on a Saturday while the children were occupied with something in the backyard that involved a great deal of shouting from James and a great deal of Daniel attempting to impose order on whatever James had started. Elena was in the kitchen with the window open, working on preparations she'd bring to the Valley settlements the following week, and she could hear the sound of the work on the porch, the knock and set of things finding their place. She thought about what it had meant when she'd first seen this house, the solid bones of it, the unfinished wing, the boards missing from the porch. She had understood even then that a thing can be worth something before it's complete, that the evidence of work in progress is its own kind of statement about a person's intentions. Rowan came through the kitchen door with sawdust on his jacket. "Done," he said. She looked at him. "The whole thing?" "Every board." He went to the basin and washed his hands. "It's level." "I should hope so." "I want you to come look at it." She set down what she was doing and followed him out to the front. The porch was solid and even, no gaps, no missing boards, the railing steady when she put her hand on it. The view from it, the yard, the tree line, the ridge in the distance, was the same view it had always been, but the ground under her feet was different, complete. "Good," she said. He stood beside her. They looked at the ridge together for a moment. "You know what I keep thinking about," she said. "What?" "You walked into my clinic and said the house wasn't finished." She looked at the solid boards under her feet. "You said it like it was a drawback." "It was." "Maybe," she said. "Or maybe it was just honest about where things were." He considered that. "I didn't want to oversell it." "You never oversell anything," she said. "I've noticed." He looked at her with that particular quality, the thing she still didn't have a perfect word for after all these months, the deep-water stillness of a person who was completely present without demanding anything in return for it. "I'm glad you came through that door the second time," she said. "You're the one who told me to come back in 3 days." "I know I did." "You knew what you were doing?" She thought about it, honestly. "I knew I wasn't ready to say no," she said. "Whether that's the same as knowing what I was doing is a separate question." He made the almost laugh sound. She had come to love that sound the way you come to love the specific sound of a particular door in a house, not because it's beautiful, but because it means someone is home. The summer settled into itself the way summers do, full of work and small arguments and the ordinary noise of a house that had 4 children's worth of energy in it, which was, Elena would not pretend otherwise, genuinely exhausting some days. James was James, always and entirely. Daniel was quieter than he had been and louder than he used to be, and Elena thought about what that shift had cost him and what it meant that he'd made it, and she was grateful for the cost he'd paid to get here because she could see on his face that it was worth it to him. Clara was Clara, watchful and fierce and privately warm in the ways she chose. She had decided, somewhere in the spring, to start teaching Daniel to play the card game that she and Elena had played on winter evenings since she was 5. She taught him with the same serious methodology she brought to everything, explaining each rule once and expecting it to be remembered. Daniel was a quick learner, which satisfied her. By June they played without Elena, and the sound of the 2 of them at the table in the evenings, Clara explaining a strategy in her precise way, Daniel's brief questions, the slap of cards, was something Elena had not anticipated and could not have planned for, and was therefore the kind of thing she trusted most. One evening in August, sitting on the completed porch in the last of the day's light, Rowan said, "I think this is what I was building it for." She looked at him. "I was watching the yard, where all four children were in various states of activity that she had stopped trying to catalog individually. "The house?" she asked. "All of it," he said. "The house is just the part I could do with my hands." She sat with that for a moment. "You knew what you were building toward even when you didn't know what it would look like." "Mostly," he said. "I knew the shape of it, not the specifics." She thought about the morning he'd told her he wasn't good at talking around things. It was still true. It had never been a limitation. It was simply his way, to locate the thing and say it directly without the performance of indirection. She put her hand over his on the armrest between them. He turned his palm up and held it. The ridge was going gold in the late light. Down in the valley, Blackridge Pass was settling into its evening rhythms, and somewhere in the territorial capital, the investigation was still unfolding, and somewhere Voss was dealing with the consequences of what happened when you built a machine in the dark, and someone came along who was very good at finding things that were wrong and turned on a light. And here, on the mountain, in the house that was finally finished, a woman who had learned to carry grief without letting it become her whole story, and a man who had learned that honesty was worth more than a clean reputation, sat on a solid porch in the summer light with their children loud and alive in the yard below. It was not a perfect life. There would be more hard winters, more patience she couldn't save, more days when the weight of everything was simply heavy. Clara would have hard years ahead, and Elena knew it. Daniel still went quiet sometimes in a way that reminded her of old sorrow finding its groove. Rowan had mornings when something from the past crossed his face before he could manage it, and she had learned to let those mornings be what they were without fixing them. None of it was finished in the way that finish sometimes meant. But the roof was solid. The porch was level. The shelf with Thomas's handwriting was on the kitchen wall, and dinner would be loud, and the ridge would still be there in the morning. That was enough. Not because she had settled, but because she had learned, through 3 years of hard-kept mornings, and 2 children and a feed-shed clinic, and a fight she had not planned to be the center of, that enough, when it's genuinely enough, is not a small thing. It is, in fact, the whole thing. She held Rowan's hand on the armrest and watched the light change on the mountain, and she did not reach for anything more than what was right there, and what was right there was full.